common problem in drawing windows is that they often end up looking very flat, almost as if they've been drawn onto the outside of the window with a marker pen, as if they're more a cartoon than a real three-dimensional shape. Another big problem is that windows often don't look as though they're sitting very happily on the outside building, that they follow a different wall direction to what they're on. We're going to look at these and some other issues in drawing windows that stop our windows looking as real and as three-dimensional as they could. So I'm starting by drawing, if you like, a simplified version of our windows. This is the corner of a building in Vienna. And while I draw this, just off camera, I have a print of a drawing that I found in an Instagram account, which reflects all of the things I'm talking about in this drawing here. Some of the approaches to drawing a window, which I feel like perhaps don't do justice to the architecture of the building and don't represent the windows in the way that probably the artist would prefer to. You can see that these windows, firstly, are drawn very simply. These first two windows are almost identical, whereas if we look at our reference photo, there's quite a lot of difference. And in fact, the third window on the right-hand side is created where it doesn't really exist in the reference photo. But what we know about the shape of the windows can be hard to resist actually including, even when it's not there. And this partly comes from not looking back at our reference photo frequently enough. So as we continue around the corner of the building, we imagine something that we haven't actually seen because of what we do understand about the structure of the building. The other obvious thing about these windows is that there's no depth line, there's no 3D line, there's no line to indicate where these shapes have more than two dimensions. Certainly not in any of these windows. They really are just single lines. And then the decorative bands between the windows are also single lines. They could just be lines drawn onto the building with a giant black marker. They don't really look real. These curved lines that we have between the rows of windows are also not right. They're simplified and they're exaggerated. We've seen a curve on that first one that we drew. We've exaggerated the curve because for some reason it was more prominent in our mind than it should have been. And now we've repeated that same curve pretty much under each row of windows, even though the curve actually flattens as it goes down. And for that matter, increases as it goes up. But we've kept it pretty much the same. And so there's this simplification, particularly with the windows, of simplifying the shapes and of not having any depth lines at all. Now we'll have a go at drawing this same section of windows on this corner of the building. But we'll make a little more effort to observe them more carefully. And we'll also be particularly aware of lines to create a sense of depth in our windows. So the first window we draw, we see pretty much straight on. But there's still a degree of depth that we can represent by two lines very close together. And certainly with these decorative lines, we can do two lines to represent the gap that's between them. Now, this row of window in the center of the windows that we can see is the one that has a lot of depth in it because the corner of the building curves around quite significantly. And we only actually see half of the, if you like, the blackness of the room behind that we see in the first window that we've drawn. And in the third window, that's really on the front side of the building more than anything else, we don't see any of the space of the room behind. We just see some of the depth of the inset of the window in the wall. But once we've established these three by really careful observation, it is a little faster and more straightforward to draw the windows underneath, because although the perspective curve lessens, that's pretty much the only difference. Otherwise, these windows are pretty similar in their basic forms, although the decorative elements that surround them are different. And I spent more time just checking those decorative elements in this section than I did actually on the windows themselves. Because if we take the time to get the first windows correct, where they do repeat going downwards in each column, if you like, of windows, we can just repeat the one that we've got in front. So these windows did certainly get quicker and quicker to draw, but the fact that the decorations changed did slow me down. And this decoration at the top of this lower level of windows, I had to be careful to foreshorten the decoration in that center section of windows, because what we see is very different to what we see in the first one where we look at it straight on. And they're the things that create the illusion of curve consistently down the corner of this building. And we really need to make the effort to do that. There's not much that we see of the side street facade of this building, but there are some parts that protrude that I wanted to include, because these are the things where if you miss them out, it's not so obvious. But if you include them, it really gives a sense of reality that's hard to pinpoint exactly, but just works really well if the drawing is otherwise looking realistic. Let's have a look at our three images: the reference photo, the first somewhat simplified drawing, and the second drawing that takes more elements of our reference into account. The most obvious thing to me is that this first drawing looks overall more rounded, as if it was more of a tower than of a rounded corner of a basically rectangular building. And that's because these curves haven't been adequately observed. And once one curve has been committed to, it's basically been repeated all the way down and up, rather than a closer observation which shows that what curvature there is greater the higher up we go because of the perspective, and the lower down we come, the more all the lines tend towards the horizontal. But to me, almost equally obvious is the fact that these windows almost appear to be drawn on to a wall, or appear to be giant stickers that have been peeled off and stuck on, because the simplification of what's in the reference just doesn't give us enough information visually to really understand the surface that they're on and what's happening to it from the distance we're viewing it from. The most obvious thing we have in these windows is depth. The walls have a depth because the windows are set into the walls. And while this is a somewhat accurate representation of this window that we are seeing more straight on, this next window on a part of the wall curving away presents a very different view. And in fact, we have only approximately half of the width of shadowed room behind the window that we have in the first. But without deliberate observation of our drawing, it's easy, once we've established what one window looks like, to presume that all the windows basically are the same. And at the point where I'm drawing this window, it's actually easier to look at this window I've already drawn than to look back at my reference and get a more accurate viewpoint. Whereas here we have the thickness of the wall allowed for. And we also have something of an allowance of the fact that we're slightly looking up on these horizontal pieces, particularly in the upper two stories. When we get to this third window, in fact, if we look at our reference, we see that we don't see any window at all. We see that we don't see any glassed area. What we see is some of the depth of the wall where the window is set in further back from what we can see. Although a lack of careful observation in this first drawing has had us draw basically a narrower version of the windows we've already drawn. And the effect of that visually is that our wall doesn't curve around as tightly as it should. It makes it look as though it's a much more shallow, wider curve, and that there are more windows on that curve than really are. We also have these single lines here to represent what's probably decorative moulding to imitate rows of stone blocks. And yet a single line is somewhat insufficient to represent the width of the line that we have in the reference. And in the end, looks drawn on, as opposed to the more considered drawing where we have allowed width and even depth with our lines. In the decorative elements, we've also just in this second row of columns repeated what was below or above the first window, whereas because of the angle changing, the actual shapes of what we see changes. And if we're striving for visual realism, we need to reflect that in our drawing. We've also admitted all the details that we see of the facade on the side of the building. And while it's not obvious that it's missing in this view, by adding it, it creates a sense of realism. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If we want to draw windows that look real, then firstly, the windows have to be the right shape, the position from which we're viewing them. In other words, the perspective of the windows has to be correct, whether we're looking straight ahead at that window, whether we're looking up at the window or down at the window. And the overall shape of the window and what we see must also follow whatever the wall is doing at the same time. And this goes not just for the rectangular shape of the actual window, but just as much for all of the decorative elements that might surround it in some way. But once we've got fundamentally the outline of the window correct, we have to draw enough lines to represent the three-dimensionality of that window. The little ledges, the little step backs, the thickness of the wall, how far back the glass actually is set within the wooden struts that hold it in place. And even a sense of perhaps some window edging on the inside of the glass, depending where the light's coming from and how far it penetrates into the interior of the room space. If we're looking up at a window, then we need to have that 3D depth line to represent the depth. And the higher up we go, the further apart it needs to be from the bottom line of our shape. And the same goes for all the decorative elements. If we don't want them to look that they're drawn onto the outside of the wall with a marker pen, then we need to show the depth where there is depth. As always, so much comes back to we need to look at our reference photo so much more carefully before we start to draw. And then when we do start to draw, we need to go back to our reference photo sooner than we think, because it's quite possible that we don't have enough information in our head to go on to the next bit accurately. I'll post this photo onto my YouTube community page. So if you want to have a go drawing these windows and doing your best to make them look really three-dimensional, to give them a real sense of visual reality, I reckon it's a great exercise to practice on. And go back and have a look at some of your drawings and see whether some of your windows look just a bit too drawn on with a pen, a little cartoon-like. Let's face it, if we draw architecture, we end up drawing a lot of windows. So it's really worth a bit more effort to achieve a higher level of realism with them. And of course, the important thing is, as we do it, to have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.